Imagine quiet and calm mornings when the world is still shrouded in a light fog and there is a coolness in the air. In the distance, beyond the monastery walls, nothing disturbs the silence. In this world, filled with deep meaning and spiritual harmony, live monks, people who have dedicated their lives to serving God, searching for inner peace and selfless work. Medieval monks were not just men in simple clothes, they were part of a complex and multi-layered society. Their lives often remain unnoticed by historians, but they were full of unique details that make monastic life a fascinating subject for study. For many of them, the monastery became not just a refuge, but also a place where they sought holiness and salvation, and their day was strictly structured. Monastic life in the Middle Ages was a journey full of hardships, but also of inner peace. It began with a simple desire to be closer to God and dedicate one's life to service. But what actually happened in these monasteries? How were the monks' daily routines organized? How did they live, and what awaited them each new day? In this video, we will try to answer these questions, immersing you in a soothing narrative about what it meant to be a monk in the Middle Ages. Before we begin, if you are interested in learning more about what happened in history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. This will help us create even more exciting stories for you. Now tell me, how much time do you have and where are you? Share with us. We'd love to know where our stories are listened to. Let us imagine what it was like in those distant centuries, when the world was just beginning to absorb Christian teachings, when faith was just beginning to penetrate the depths of human hearts. Imagine the Middle Ages, a time of difficult trials and contradictions, when every day was filled with anxiety about the future, about life, about sins. In this context, monasticism became not just a religious movement, but also a way to find consolation, meaning, and salvation in a world where everyday worries could overshadow any dreams. Monasticism became a symbol of the rejection of worldly pleasures and the desire for purity and inner harmony. In times when human life was cruel and difficult, when poverty and illness were an integral part of existence, the monastery offered not only physical shelter, but also spiritual protection. In it, monks sought peace, and most importantly, salvation. Their entire lives were dedicated to God, but this path was not easy. When we talk about monasticism, it is important to understand that it did not arise suddenly as a result of a single event or decision. On the contrary, it was a consequence of deep and significant changes that were taking place in society and in the religious life of that time. At the beginning of the 4th century, with the adoption of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, a process began that gradually spread throughout Europe. People began to seek solitude, to renounce worldly values. This was not just a rejection of material goods, but also a search for deep spiritual purification. Monasteries became not only spiritual centers, but also intellectual, cultural, and educational institutions. The existence of monasteries is not only fervent prayers and vows of poverty, but also a huge work that touched many areas of life. Monks copied sacred texts, preserved ancient knowledge, taught future generations. In their hands was a whole library of knowledge, which allowed preserving the legacy of antiquity, when many books were lost in the turbulent times of the fall of the Roman Empire. Let's dwell on this important point for a moment. Monks not only prayed and sought salvation, they did important and difficult work that was not only spiritual, but also practical. Their work consisted of maintaining and preserving order in the monastery, caring for the land, the cattle, copying books, creating works of art. This work was an integral part of their lives, and when there was so much fear and anxiety in the world, the monastery was the very place that helped people feel safe and meaningful. Monasticism became an important social institution that provided peace, but also dealt with important matters for society. It is not surprising that every year the number of people seeking to become monks increased. Monasteries were open to everyone, from rich and noble people to poor peasants who sought salvation from a hard life in a monastery. Each of them had their own reason for becoming a monk. For some, it was a desire for purity and repentance. For others, a way to find inner peace away from the bustle of the world. The monastic way of life attracted many, especially those who were disillusioned with worldly affairs or who were looking for more meaning in their lives. There was a kind of freedom hidden in this renunciation of the material world. Freedom from the worries and anxieties that consume people daily in their lives outside the monasteries. Monks voluntarily renounced family ties, personal ambitions, and concerns about property. which allowed them to focus only on the spiritual life. But beyond the religious and spiritual component, monasteries also became places where the best agricultural crops were grown and where people's health was taken care of. Many monks became doctors, herbalists, and teachers. Workshops were created in monasteries where books were copied, and works of art were created, and rare herbs and plants were grown in gardening workshops. In this sense, monasteries were not only spiritual centers, but also important strongholds of knowledge and culture for the entire society. Thus, monasticism became popular not only as a religious movement, but also as an important social necessity. It became a response to the challenges of the time: wars, epidemics, devastation, and uncertainty. For people seeking the meaning of life, the monastery was a refuge where they could survive difficult times and find their inner peace. Imagine how much time and effort it took to create such places. Places where people not only sought salvation for their souls, but also built entire societies, engaged in education, the preservation of knowledge, and the maintenance of order. In such conditions, a deep respect for the monastic way of life arose, and monks, with their selfless lives, became important figures in society, important for the preservation of knowledge and tradition, and the continuation of culture in a period when destruction seemed inevitable. Monasticism indeed became something more than just a religious movement. It was something that had a profound impact on the development of society, culture, and even politics. Monasteries were places where people sought to escape worldly temptations and worries, but at the same time, they became powerful engines of change in a world that needed these spiritual and practical transformations. Consider how these monks, people who dedicated their lives to serving God, created a world that stood apart from the outside world, but at the same time influenced the whole of society. The lives of monks were deeply rooted in spirituality, but they were also incredibly important in maintaining the cultural and intellectual foundations of civilization in these turbulent and war-torn times. Every day, more and more people were searching for this inner peace, and monasteries became oases where they could come to get rid of all external worries and find their answers. Monasticism became not just a religion, but also an answer to the search for meaning, truth, and inner peace in this difficult world. Now that we more or less understand why monasticism became so important and necessary for people in the Middle Ages, let's smoothly move on to how this life unfolded in the everyday life of monks and how their day was organized. Let's go back in time for a moment, to the era when the world was just beginning to transform into what we know today. The Middle Ages is a time when human life was inseparable from religion, when every action and every word seemed imbued with sacred meaning. During this period, monasticism became not just a religious phenomenon, but a real cultural and social necessity. Why did it become so popular? Why did thousands of people, despite difficult conditions, decide to renounce the world and devote themselves to life in monasteries? First, let us consider the situation of that time. Century after century, humanity experienced endless wars, invasions, epidemics, and social upheavals. People felt constant fear, anxiety, uncertainty about the future. It was a time when personal life often became unbearable, and hope for a better future disappeared under the weight of disasters. In these circumstances, monasticism became something more than just a religious teaching. It became a consolation and a source of stability for people seeking salvation, peace, and meaning in a troubled world. But why did monasteries become such an important institution in society? Why did so many people seek to enter monasteries, despite all the difficulties associated with this life? The reasons were multifaceted, and they began with spiritual and philosophical quests. At that time, Christianity had become the main religion of the Roman Empire, as well as a huge cultural force permeating all spheres of life. However, religion, which was once a simple faith in God, gradually developed and took on new forms. One of these new trends was monasticism, which began to attract people not only with its religious essence, but also with a way of life in which one could forget the worries and aspirations of the outside world. The monks, turning away from worldly pleasures, chose the path of asceticism, work, and prayer. This was the path of spiritual purity on which a person could achieve closeness with God, atone for his sins, and perhaps receive salvation. But to do this, it was necessary to renounce everything that could distract from this goal, from family ties, from worries about wealth, from ambitions and desires. Let's not forget that life in the Middle Ages was not easy. Wars, ruin, epidemics, crop failure, All these disasters accompanied people. In conditions of constant threat of death and fear, the desire to go to a monastery became a logical choice for those who sought peace. Monasteries offered refuge from the outside world, as well as the opportunity to find inner peace and find the meaning of life. This withdrawal from the world was not just a rejection of material goods, but also an attempt to find truth and spiritual purification. One of the most important reasons why monasticism became so attractive was that monasteries served as places where knowledge was preserved. Monks copied sacred texts, worked on philosophical treatises, and collected knowledge about nature and human life. Science, art, and medicine developed in these institutions. Monasteries were intellectual centers, repositories of ancient wisdom. Without these monasteries, much of the knowledge we now take for granted would have been lost. But let us pause for a moment and think about what exactly attracted people to dedicate themselves to monastic life. One of the reasons could be an inner urge to seek meaning in a world that seemed filled with suffering. Medieval man was surrounded by many difficulties: hunger, disease, violence, the constant threat of war. In this context, the monastery became a refuge, a place where a person could find solace and purpose that would give him the strength to confront the world with its tragedies and worries. The spiritual life in the monastery was full of practice, prayer, dedication, but also work. The essence of monastic life was that the monks not only prayed, but also worked, creating entire communities that were engaged in agriculture, crafts, and processing materials. Imagine, monasteries were self-sufficient units where there was no room for idleness. Each day began with prayer, then came work. It could be cultivating the land, growing plants, caring for animals, copying books, or creating handicrafts. This work was an important part of monastic life. It not only supported the monastery, but also allowed the monks to feel a connection with the land, with nature, with the very basis of life. In the monastery, work was sacred. It brought inner satisfaction, and in this labor process, the monks felt a deep spiritual connection with God. Agriculture, craft workshops, copying sacred texts, all this became part of their path to holy life. Understanding monasticism as a path of dedication and work is important to understanding why it attracted so many people. Monasteries not only offered spiritual protection, but also the opportunity to work for the greater good. And despite the hardships of monastic life, many people, especially in times of social instability, chose to devote themselves to this path. Monks not only served God, they became important figures in society. They played the role of teachers and guardians of traditions. The monastery was a place where knowledge was passed on, where ancient texts and philosophical teachings were studied and preserved. These monasteries were centers of education and culture. Strict discipline, orderly life, and established practices created a structure in which one could learn, grow, and develop. It was the monasteries that preserved knowledge of agriculture, medicine, crafts, and philosophy, which later became the basis for the restoration of cultural life in Europe. Think about what our culture and history would be like without monasteries, without monks who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. In monasteries, books were copied, treatises and studies were created, works of art were painted, monks were engaged in scientific work, and their workshops and laboratories were centers of innovation. It was thanks to monasteries that the bulk of knowledge about antiquity was preserved, and the foundations of scientific research and educational systems were laid, which later developed in European universities. All these factors together made monasticism incredibly popular in the Middle Ages. But what is most interesting is that monasteries became not only places of spiritual purification, but also real centers for the preservation of culture, science, and traditions. Monks could be spiritual leaders and scientists, and guardians of art at the same time. And this is perhaps one of the most amazing aspects of monastic life, because its goal was not only to find inner peace, but also to create a world around itself, which others aspired to enter. Now that we have a more detailed understanding of the reasons for the popularity of monasticism, let us delve into how the monks lived in these monasteries. How were their days organized? How did their work, prayers, and rituals proceed? How did they cope with difficulties, and what was truly important to them in this life filled with deep faith and selfless work? Imagine the soft light of dawn filtering through tall stained glass windows and illuminating marble floors where monks prepare for their next prayer in peace and quiet. In this quiet solitude, behind the walls of the monastery, begins a day of work, service, and deep contemplation. However, despite their apparent uniformity, the monasteries of the Middle Ages were not all the same. They differed not only in their architectural style, but also in their principles of organizing life, their customs, and even their philosophical tendencies. Each monastic community was unique, and the types of monasteries in the Middle Ages developed in response to the cultural, social, and political needs of the time. The monasteries of that time could be divided into several main types, and each of them had its own characteristics that distinguished them from each other. There were monasteries that dedicated their lives to strict discipline and silence, and there were those that sought a more open interaction with the world. The monks of these monasteries could engage in various types of work: education, medicine, and even scientific research. All this took place against the background of spiritual quests and deep service to God. The first and perhaps most famous order to establish the foundations of monastic life in the Middle Ages were the Benedictines. The order was founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, and their rule became the basis for many monastic orders in the following centuries. The Benedictines are known for their strict discipline and emphasis on daily work. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, the monks' lives were carefully organized. The day began with prayer, then work, and then more prayer and meditation. Among the Benedictines, there was the idea of ora et labora, pray and work. This was the basic rule of their lives. The monks believed that work was a form of service, and thus every activity they did, whether it was copying sacred texts, gardening, or building, was imbued with spiritual meaning. Even the simplest task was considered an act of service. Another prominent and significant monastic order were the Franciscans, founded by Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century. The Franciscans took a completely different path than the Benedictines. They dedicated their lives to poverty, humility, and service to the poor. Saint Francis believed that monks should live among people, be an example of humility and repentance. Unlike the Benedictines, the Franciscans did not build large and majestic monasteries. Instead, they preferred to live in simplicity and poverty, among ordinary people, helping them and sharing their difficulties. Franciscan monasteries were places where they preached not only in words but also in actions. They sought to set an example by their lives, spreading the teachings of mercy and compassion. These monks actively helped the poor, were involved in social work and medical care. The Franciscans believed that serving people was also serving God, and so they actively interacted with the outside world. This order also attracted many followers. The simple lifestyle and deep spirituality attracted people tired of the difficult political and social situation in Europe at that time. The Franciscans not only helped those in need, but also actively spread the ideas of the need for fidelity to God and life in peace and harmony with others. The next order that played an important role in the development of monasticism were the Dominicans, founded by Saint Dominic in the early 13th century. The Dominicans differed from previous orders in their focus on education and intellectual development. The Dominicans sought to become preachers and missionaries, teaching people in towns and villages, spreading Christian values. It was an order that was distinguished by a lively desire for knowledge and deep philosophical reflection. The Dominicans were also considered inquisitors, and their role in the Christian fight against heretics in the Middle Ages was extremely significant. However, they were also the founders of universities and educational institutions. These monks actively promoted Christian theology, were engaged in the dissemination of literature and philosophical works, creating huge libraries and centers of science. They studied with the best scientists of their time and sought to convey this knowledge to the people. Their monasteries were true intellectual centers where the most complex questions of faith, philosophy, and science were discussed. They were places where people could get an education, learn, and develop themselves while discussing the most important questions of religion and morality. Not all monasteries sought to be closer to the world. The Carthusians, an order founded in the 11th century by Saint Bruno, chose the path of greatest solitude. Carthusian monasteries were the strictest, and monks living in such communities had to observe strict silence and lead a life of absolute asceticism. Carthusians spent most of their time in meditation, prayer, and labor related to agriculture or crafts. Solitude was not only a physical act for the Carthusians, but also a spiritual one. They believed that in silence and peace one could better hear the voice of God. These monasteries became almost sacred places where monks could fully devote themselves to their search for spiritual enlightenment. The last order worth mentioning is the Augustinians. Based on the teachings of Saint Augustine, the monks of this order combined elements of both community life and active participation in public affairs. The Augustinians believed that monks should not only pray, but also actively work for the good of society. These were communities in which work and prayer went hand in hand, and monks sought to create harmonious and spiritually fulfilling relationships with the world around them. The Augustinians were involved in education, taught in schools and universities, and were also active in social projects. The Augustinian monasteries became centers where spiritual and cultural values were supported. And, thanks to this, they also played an important role in strengthening Christian culture in the Middle Ages. Thus, the monasteries of the Middle Ages were not simply religious institutions, but also centers of power, knowledge, and culture. Each order, from the Benedictines to the Franciscans, Carthusians, and Dominicans, had its own characteristics, its own mission, and its own goals. They embodied different aspects of monastic life, from strict discipline and work to the pursuit of knowledge and service to society. Monasteries, despite their outward simplicity, were the most important centers of spiritual and cultural revival in the Middle Ages. Today we can only imagine how these institutions, filled with prayer, work, and reflection, became the stronghold of Christian culture and science in those dark times when the light of knowledge was almost extinguished. Monasticism in the Middle Ages was not just a religious calling, but a real vow, a whole life journey that began with a deep spiritual decision and was accompanied by many rituals, trials, and vows. Becoming a monk was not only a choice of faith, but also a long process of entering a new life, different from everything a person knew before. But how exactly did one become a monk in the Middle Ages? What were the steps that a future monk went through, and what awaited him along the way? Let's dive into this process together, step by step, and figure out how a layman turned into a monk. Monasticism in the Middle Ages was not just a religious obligation or a family tradition. It was an inner, secret desire to dedicate one's life to serving God. The calling to become a monk often did not arise overnight. It was the result of deep spiritual reflection, often caused by experiences or difficult trials in life. Perhaps someone had experienced the loss of a loved one, experienced personal tragedies, or was shaken by the wars and epidemics that ravaged the world. Life in the Middle Ages was often difficult. Instability, war, poverty, and illness took the lives of many people. In such a situation, a monastery became not just a place of solitude, but an escape from external adversity, from the world with its anxiety and suffering. But tragic events were not always behind this decision. Sometimes monks sought to enter a monastery because of a desire to dedicate themselves to serving God, having felt a deep spiritual need that surpassed everyday worries. This calling could be heard at an early age, or it could arise after many years of life in the world. But in any case, the decision to become a monk was made only after much thought, since it was associated with a complete rejection of worldly pleasures, family, and ordinary life. Once a person decided to become a monk, the process of being accepted into the monastery began, and this process was quite long and detailed. First, the future monk had to declare his desire to become part of the monastic community. This could be done openly, through a conversation with the abbot of the monastery, or through letters if the person was far from the monastery he wanted to end up in. This decision meant the beginning of a long journey, which was not a return. Sometimes, prospective monks would come to the monastery in search of answers to their questions, or in the hope that monastic life would help them cope with their spiritual torments. However, before they could finally take their vows, they had to go through a testing process called the period of novitiate. An important stage on the path to monastic life was the novitiate. This was the time when a newcomer, called a novice, went through initial trials and training. The novitiate was a time of testing, a trial of one's faith and determination. During this time, a person did not have the right to fully participate in monastic life. He was subordinate to mentors, learned rituals, daily routine, prayers, and work. The novice lived among the monks, but was not yet a full member of the community. He was the one who studied, who prepared for a new life, and also showed his readiness to renounce the old world and immerse himself in the world of spirituality, work, and prayer. During the novice period, a person encountered the strict monastery routine. He learned to maintain peace, discipline, and order. He was engaged in such tasks as helping with household chores, cleaning, caring for the garden and animals. This was a time when it was tested how much the novice was ready to follow the strict rules and laws of monastic life. This was not only physical training, but also spiritual, because the monks believed that every work, even the most modest and everyday, was a service to God. If the novice passed this stage successfully, he could take the vows, a crucial moment that meant he became a full member of the monastic community. This process was not just a ceremony, it was a spiritual rite that confirmed the person's readiness to dedicate his life to God and the monastic service. Taking the vows meant a complete renunciation of the old life, family, property, personal ambitions, and all worldly pleasures. It was an act of complete rejection of everything that defined the previous life. New monks usually took 3 basic vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of poverty meant the renunciation of private property, even minimal material well-being. Monks had no right to own land, money, or anything else that could distract them from serving God. The vow of chastity meant complete abstinence from marriage and sexual relations. And finally, the vow of obedience consisted of submission to the abbot and the monastic rules, without the right to personal initiative or decision, without the consent of the abbot. The process of taking vows was ceremonial, often taking place in the presence of the entire community. During the ceremony, the monk would recite his vows out loud, symbolizing his willingness to give up his old life. This ceremony was usually accompanied by prayers, readings of sacred texts, and special blessings from senior monks. At the same time, the new monk received new clothes, simple and modest, which symbolized his new status. After a new monk took his vows, his full monastic life began. But this process was not only about following external rules, but also about gradually deepening his spiritual life. The monks believed that their lives should be dedicated to prayer, reflection, and deep spiritual searching. They sought to find unity with God through daily rituals, meditation, and prayer. Monastic life was not only about work and discipline, but also about finding inner peace. Each day began with morning prayer and reading sacred texts, and then the monks began their work and other duties. In the evening, they gathered again for prayers, ending the day in peace and quiet. The monks did not simply pray for themselves, but for the entire world. Prayer and work were intertwined, becoming part of a single path. In this process, not only external submission was important, but also internal transformation. Monks were expected to strive for spiritual purification, to renounce all worldly temptations in order to devote their lives entirely to God. But monastic life was not easy. Each monk faced trials, both external and internal. Renouncing worldly life meant giving up many familiar things, and this was not easy. Monks often struggled with temptations, the desire to return to the world, nostalgia for the old days, doubts about their choice. There were moments when a monk wondered if his path was right, and then he had to seek support in prayer and the instructions of older brothers. Monastic life was full of struggle with oneself, with desires and thoughts that could distract one from the spiritual path. Therefore, many monasteries held certain periods of fasting and abstinence to strengthen the spiritual fortitude of their monks. During these moments, they tested their strength and faith, receiving support from the community and their mentors. The process of becoming a monk in the Middle Ages was not instantaneous. It was a long journey that required a person's full devotion and inner transformation. It was a life in which each day was filled with work, prayer, meditation, and reflection. But it was also a journey that allowed a person to become part of a large monastic community united by faith and the desire for holiness. Now that we have studied the monk's path in more detail, his first steps in the monastery, let's smoothly move on to how he spent his day. What awaited the monk in his daily life? How was his routine organized, and what was important to him in this strictly organized and spiritual life? In the Middle Ages, monasteries were not only spiritual havens, but also centers of education. It was here that knowledge was guarded and intellectual traditions were transmitted, which allowed humanity to preserve its culture and civilization. For monks, monastic education was an integral part of their path, and it began from the earliest years of novitiate. Education in medieval monasteries played a key role in the lives of monks, and the process of learning and education itself could be both strict and gentle, depending on the monastic order and the specific monastery. But what was this education like? How did it develop and how did it proceed in monasteries? What role did monks play in preserving and transmitting knowledge? We will delve into this topic and explore how the educational life of monks in the Middle Ages took place. First of all, it is worth noting that monastic education was not limited to studying secular sciences. Monks always set themselves the goal of not only developing their mental abilities, but also deepening their faith and spiritual understanding of the world. Education in monasteries was closely linked to religious practice, and everything that monks were taught had one common goal: to lead them to spiritual enlightenment and service to God. In monasteries, all academic disciplines, from reading sacred texts to philosophical reflection, served to deepen faith. Monks believed that studying books was not just a process of accumulating knowledge, but an act of prayer and service that opened the way to God. In this sense, learning was not just an intellectual activity, but also a spiritual path, in which each step brought the monk closer to his Creator. Education began with the study of the basics of the Christian faith, prayers, and the texts of the Holy Scriptures. The very first steps toward knowledge in the monastery began with novices and junior monks studying the Old and New Testaments. The entire educational process was strictly structured and took place within the framework of the monastery's daily routine. Latin played a central role in monastic education. It was the language of the church, the language of worship and sacred texts, and the language in which books were copied and scholarly work was conducted. To become a full-fledged monk in the Middle Ages, it was necessary to master Latin. It was not only the language of prayer, but also the means by which a monk could access the intellectual achievements of his time. Latin was for a monk like a key to the vast expanses of knowledge. Reading and understanding Latin texts, both theological and philosophical, was a mandatory stage of monastic education. Monks learned grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic in Latin. This also included the study of classical literature, such as the works of great thinkers like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and other philosophers and theologians, whose works became an integral part of the curriculum. Knowledge of Latin gave monks the opportunity to participate in the intellectual debates of the time, to read texts that defined the foundations of Christian philosophy and theology. It was a key element without which it was impossible to imagine a full-fledged monastic education. One of the most important aspects of monastic education was the copying of texts. Monks performed this work in scriptoria, special rooms designed for copying and rewriting sacred books and philosophical treatises. This activity was not only physical labor, but also an important spiritual process. Monks copied texts with the utmost care because they believed that by contributing their labor to the creation of sacred books, they were bringing benefit to God. Copying texts in monasteries was the primary way of preserving knowledge. For centuries, it was monks who ensured the preservation and transmission of ancient and medieval texts. Without their work, much of ancient Greek and Roman literature would probably have been lost. Monasteries became the keepers of knowledge, and monks were the ones who passed on that knowledge to future generations. Picture a monk sitting at a table in a dimly lit scriptorium, carefully transcribing the words of ancient texts onto parchment. The process was painstaking, and each new manuscript was a valuable contribution to the preservation of knowledge. It was not just copying, but a form of sacred work imbued with spiritual meaning. Copying books became the primary means of learning, and the process was an important part of monastic life. However, monastic education was not limited to reading and copying. In monasteries, much attention was paid to practical training through work. Monks learned not only spiritual things, but also earthly things. Monasteries taught agriculture, crafts, and arts, which were also considered part of their service. For monks, work was an important element of their life and education. It is believed that it was the monks, engaged in agricultural work, who first introduced new farming methods to Europe, such as the use of a plow and crop rotation, which significantly increased crop yields. Education through work included craft workshops where monks learned blacksmithing, construction, making clothes, and other necessary things. This work was not separated from spiritual life. On the contrary, it became an important part of monastic service. Monasteries became centers not only of religious, but also of practical life, where monks could combine work and prayer. It is also necessary to note the importance of monastic libraries. Monasteries in the Middle Ages became not only centers of religious life, but also cultural and educational repositories. Each large monastic brotherhood had its own library which contained books, manuscripts, and sacred texts. These libraries were real treasure houses of knowledge, preserving the heritage of ancient culture and early Christianity. The monks were trained not only in theology, but also in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, which allowed them to practice medicine and other scientific research. The monasteries included scholars such as Robert Grosseteste, Thomas Aquinas, and other philosophers and theologians whose works had a huge influence on the development of European science. Monasteries thus became intellectual centers that spread knowledge throughout Europe. They educated monks and also shared knowledge with the world. It was thanks to monasteries and their libraries that ancient philosophy was preserved and European science and education began to develop. It is also important to note that monastic education in the Middle Ages also included a system of mentoring. Senior monks passed on their knowledge and experience to younger ones. This learning took place through dialogues, discussions, and joint study of sacred texts and philosophical works. The most important element of monastic education was community learning, where each monk could learn from others and also share his knowledge with his brothers. Thus, monastic education in the Middle Ages was a complex process that included not only spiritual education, but also practical, social, and intellectual development. It played a key role in the formation of the monk's personality and in the preservation and dissemination of the knowledge of that time. Education was not only a way of learning, but also a way of serving God, creating a new society, and preserving the most important values and knowledge for future generations. Now that we have looked at how education in the monasteries took place in more detail, let us delve into the daily life of the monks. How did their day begin? What duties and tasks did they perform? How did work and prayer fit into their daily lives? Every morning in the monastery began not as just another day, but as the beginning of a new path, where spirituality and work merged. Imagine how the fog had not yet cleared, and the world was just beginning to fill with light. In the silence, broken only by the singing of birds and the light rustling of leaves, the monks woke up, preparing for another day that would be filled not only with physical labor, but also with deep spiritual practices. The monk's morning was dedicated to God, and every morning action became part of a sacred ritual that set the rhythm of the day. This ritual began even before the first rays of the sun touched the earth and continued until sunset. How did a monk's day begin in the Middle Ages? What steps made up the morning routine, and how did each morning connect the monk to his spiritual purpose? Let's dive into the details of a monk's morning routine to understand how important each morning action was, filled with meaning and symbolism. Medieval monks rose early, often before dawn. It was a time when the world was at its calmest and quietest, and fog hung over the land. Nature was in a state of expectation, and the monks rose to spend the first moments of their day with God in this solitude. Rising was associated with spiritual discipline and required absolute devotion. The monk did not simply rise, but prepared himself for service, for his inner purification. On average, monks would rise around 3 to 4 a.m., depending on the region and monastery. The first moment they opened their eyes was the time to thank God for the new day. Imagine how in the silence a monk, still slumbering, begins to prepare in his thoughts and prayers for the days of work and prayer to come. The monk began the day by gathering in his place in silence and peace for prayer and reflection. The outside world was not yet ready to meet people, and this time became a moment for self-reflection and connection with God. It was a personal time for the monk, when there was no obstacle in the form of noisy cities or even neighbors. The morning was for each monk his personal moment of communication with the Creator. After rising, the monks began their morning rituals of purification. Cleansing the body was not just a hygienic procedure, but also a spiritual act. At this point, the monk symbolically cleansed himself of worldly affairs and prepared to take on the spirit of service and devotion to God. Hygienic procedures did not take much time, but it was an important moment when the monk entered a state of peace and readiness for service. Monks typically washed themselves in cold water, which was also considered an element of asceticism. Water symbolized purification and atonement for sins. It was like a physical reminder of the spiritual purity they were supposed to achieve through their life in the monastery. After the morning purification, the monk would begin the first prayer of the day, called matins or matins. This was the first of several prayers that would accompany their day, and it began immediately after waking up in the morning. Matins prayer was an important part of the morning routine, and it included reading the Psalter and prayers for forgiveness of sins, giving thanks for the new day, and asking for support. It was a time when the monk recognized his dependence on God and opened the day with prayers for the direction of his thoughts and actions. Reading sacred texts, especially from the Bible, was an essential part of a monk's morning routine. For monks, reading scripture was not just study, but part of their spiritual practice, part of their service. Monasteries had many books, many of which the monks copied themselves in scriptoria. At this stage, many monks began their day by reading a portion of the Holy Scriptures or other religious texts, and this was an important part of their spiritual nourishment. As a rule, morning reading concerned not only prayers and prayer songs, but also deep reflections and theological treatises. Each monk was obliged to familiarize himself with a part of the Bible or other religious text in the morning in order to prepare his mind for the work and service ahead. These texts were not just sacred scriptures, they became the basis for spiritual growth and inner understanding. During the morning readings, monks could ponder their meaning and also pray for God to reveal the truth to them. Often monks used these moments for personal reflection, thinking about how the text could apply to their own lives. After the morning reading, the monk would gather with other members of the community for the morning service, called matins. This was the most important morning event, which united the entire monastic community. There was no room for loneliness in the monastery. Each monk was part of the common prayer that accompanied them from the very morning. There was a strictness in the rhythm and the grandeur of church singing, which united everyone in one desire, to serve God. The monks would gather in the church or another special prayer room of the monastery to begin the day with the liturgy. It is important to note that prayer was not just a formality for the monks. It was a moment of deep spiritual purification, when each of them could connect with God and feel unity with the other brothers. During the morning liturgy, prayers, psalms, chants, and various liturgical formulas were recited, making this moment very meaningful. The monasteries of that time were distinguished by their architecture and acoustics, which were specially designed so that worshippers could feel part of a single spiritual community, even if they were sitting or standing along the walls. The echo of singing in the temple enhanced the sense of holiness of what was happening, creating an atmosphere conducive to deep spiritual experience. After prayer, the monks would begin their morning meal. Unlike a modern breakfast, the monastic meal was modest, and mostly consisted of simple foods such as bread, vegetables, some fish, or, in some monasteries, dairy products. The food was simple because the monks followed a vow of poverty that limited their food choices. Breakfast was not just a meal, but also part of their spiritual practice, a moment of gratitude for God's gifts. The meal was not accompanied by conversation. It was a time of silence and reflection, and prayers for food were often said before and after the meal. Food was considered a gift from God, and therefore should be received with gratitude and respect. The monks ate together, but did not talk, so as not to be distracted from spiritual thoughts. This moment was important not only as a physical filling of the body, but also as a way to strengthen the common spiritual connection, thanks to which all the monks felt like part of a single community, supporting each other on the path to God. After breakfast, the monks began their main work, which could include copying sacred texts, working in the garden, making items for the monastery, or caring for animals. This was the moment when the monk was supposed to devote himself to service and work. But it is important to understand that in the monastery, work was never just a physical act. Every work, whether it was cleaning, gardening, or working with books, was perceived as service to God. The monk worked not to earn money or material goods, but to serve God and strengthen his faith. The monk's daily routine was not only strictly organized, but also deeply imbued with spiritual practice, uniting their work and prayer. Throughout the day, they followed a discipline, dedicating every moment of their lives to service and the search for holiness. The morning ritual was only the beginning of this path, which continued until sunset. Each day of a monk in the Middle Ages was carefully organized, and was much more than just a combination of work and prayer. It was a life dedicated to God, and every minute and every gesture was aimed at service and spiritual purification. The monastic daily routine was not a simple alternation of different activities, but a thoughtful combination of work and prayer that allowed the monk to maintain inner peace and dedication to his path. The daily routine was strictly structured, leaving no room for unnecessary work or idle talk. The monks believed that every part of their day, whether prayer, work, study, or rest, was an integral part of serving God and should be performed with maximum dedication. The alternation of work and prayer served both a spiritual and physical purpose, strengthening the monk's body and soul. As we have already mentioned, the monk's morning began early, and the first ritual of the day was dedicated to God. This is the morning prayer, which opened the new day. It is important to note that the prayer was not just words spoken out loud, but also a deep internal practice aimed at creating a spiritual connection with God. Each day began with gratitude for the gift of life, for the opportunity to serve, and for all the benefits that the monks received. These prayers were not limited to a few lines. It was a full-fledged ritual during which the monks began the day in complete harmony with God and the world around them. Monks devoted time not only to the usual morning prayer, but also to psalmody and reading sacred texts. In the monasteries, there were several services that a monk was obliged to attend during his day. Each of these rituals was accompanied by special chants and prayers, which also served the purposes of spiritual purification and inner harmony. Thus, the early morning time was filled not only with physical labor, but also with processes of deep self-awareness, inner work on oneself. Work was not only a necessity, but an integral part of monastic life. Monks believed that work was not only a way to provide for their needs, but also a way to serve God. It was an act of prayer expressed through the physical performance of daily tasks. What did a monk's work involve? It all depended on the order and the monastery's specialization. However, all monasteries had one thing in common. The work was varied, but always useful for the life of the community and society. It could be working in gardens, growing vegetables and fruits, looking after livestock, or copying sacred books and scriptoria. In some monasteries, monks were engaged in construction, creating new monastery buildings or fortifications. In addition, many monks were engaged in handicrafts, making clothes, candles, and other necessary items. It is noteworthy that the monks understood their work as a way to strengthen their spiritual connection with God. Prayer, chanting, meditation, and inner reflection were not limited to the walls of the prayer rooms. Even work in the fields or workshops became an act of prayer. The food they grew, the jewelry they created, all of this benefited not only the monastery, but also the community around it. By working for the benefit of their fellow monks and the community as a whole, the monks believed that they were also working for God. Work was also important for the monk in terms of inner purification. It became a way to cope with temptations and overcome his pride. When the monk worked, fulfilling his duties, his heart and thoughts were directed not to personal ambitions, but to service. After the morning prayers and the first work, it was time for the first meal, breakfast. This meal was not what we usually imagine a regular breakfast to be. It was a communal and unifying, not only physical, but also spiritual moment. The food the monks ate was simple, and the dining process was modest and without unnecessary noise. The monks ate in silence, without talking, so as not to be distracted from the prayerful mood and reflection. Although the food was modest, the monks always thanked God for what they were given. The meal was not only a way to satisfy hunger, but also a spiritual practice that included prayers of thanksgiving. The monasteries had a strict dietary discipline. Each meal was simple, consisting of bread, vegetables, and sometimes fish. Meat was eaten very rarely and was completely excluded during fasting periods. No less important was the moment of social cohesion during meals. Despite the absence of conversation, meals brought all the monks together, as a moment when everyone was sitting at the same table, part of the same community. These moments, although quiet, played an important role in maintaining harmony and unity within the monastery. Monastic life was not limited to prayers and work. Monasteries also had an important aspect: education and mentoring. During the day, monks were taught religious philosophy, studied sacred texts and theology. Monks attended classes after meals and main work, using this time for intellectual development. Education in monasteries was not just a process of acquiring knowledge, but also a way to strengthen spirituality. Monks studied the works of the Holy Fathers, theologians, and philosophical and scientific texts that could shed light on issues of religion and spirituality. Much attention was paid to the Latin language, as it was the language of worship and philosophy. In addition, younger monks were also taught. Senior monks, mentors, took an active part in the training of young novices, sharing their experience and knowledge. This mentoring was considered an important element in the development of monastic life. It was not only an intellectual process, but also a way to transmit spiritual experience, making the community stronger and more united. After the morning work and studies, it was time for the midday prayer, called sexta. This prayer was an important moment for every monk, as it served not only as a spiritual cleansing, but also as a break in the day when monks could rest, relax, and recuperate. It is important to note that prayers in the monastery were not only messengers of spirituality, they served as an important tool for maintaining inner peace and balance. The midday prayer was not long, but it was an important part of the day. Monks would come to the temple or pray in their cells to remember God and remind themselves of their high spiritual goals. This moment was like a pause in the fast-paced flow of life, a moment to recuperate and prepare for the rest of the day. During the rest period that followed prayer, monks could rest in their cells or in quiet corners of the monastery. This time was not without meaning. It helped to restore strength to continue the day with full dedication. The monks understood that their strength came not only from physical labor, but also from the peace of mind that they found in silence and prayer. The monks' day ended with evening prayer, Western. This moment was the culmination of the entire day, when monks gathered for a joint prayer to thank God for the day and ask for forgiveness for possible mistakes and sins. Evening prayer served not only as a spiritual cleansing, but also as a way to end the day in peace and quiet. After prayer, monks often gathered in community to share their thoughts or experiences. This was a time when they could talk to each other, discuss what they had read, reflect on spiritual texts and the experiences of the day. These conversations, although not noisy, were an important part of the life of the monastery, promoting inner unity. The evening meal was the most modest. The monks finished the day with a light supper, so as not to overwork their bodies before going to bed. After supper, they went to their cells, where they continued their personal prayer, meditation, and reflection on the past day. Before going to bed, they again turned to God, gave thanks for everything, and prepared for sleep, which was not just rest, but part of internal purification and preparation for the next day. Sleep was an important element of monastic life. Monks slept in very modest conditions, often in dormitories or small cells that were quite simple and lacked unnecessary comfort. In their understanding, sleep was necessary to restore strength in order to wake up again and continue serving God in the monastery. In the life of a monk, as in the life of any person, food plays an important role, but in a monastery, food has not only a physical meaning, but also a deeply symbolic, spiritual one. For a monk, every meal is not just a way to satisfy hunger, but also a way to thank God for all the gifts He gives. In this sense, a meal in a monastery is not just a necessity, but a moment of worship and service. The anticipation of food, the process of eating itself, and the subsequent prayers became important elements of daily monastic practice. Food was not just a product for survival, but a symbol of humility, a vow of poverty, and inner purification. Monks in the Middle Ages often lived in conditions where modesty and asceticism were the main principles of their lives. The food they ate was limited to the bare necessities, and each meal became an act of respect for God and an acknowledgement that life itself is a gift to be received with gratitude. Despite this, meals in the monastery remained an important moment for strengthening the body and maintaining the strength needed for further prayer and work. During the Middle Ages, monasteries practiced a vow of poverty, which made it difficult to access luxurious food. Monks, adhering to strict principles of poverty, had no right to excesses, and their diet was extremely modest. This was part of their spiritual path, to refuse worldly pleasures, including unnecessary food. Instead, monks preferred simple foods: bread, vegetables, fruits, and, in some cases, fish. Meat was rarely used, and most often only on special occasions or holidays. Typically, food was prepared from local products available in the monastery or its surroundings. The monks grew their own vegetables and fruits, kept animals, which allowed them to provide themselves with the necessary products. Given that the monastery was self-sufficient, the monks could control not only their food, but also the process that was associated with its production. They were often engaged in agriculture, as well as crafts, creating everything necessary for the monastery. The process of eating in the monastery was part of a deep discipline. When the monks sat at the table, they could not expect a variety of dishes or sweet treats. The food was simple, but sufficient to maintain vitality. And despite its modesty, this moment was deeply important to the monk, because every spoonful of food reminded him of his vow of poverty and service to God. Another important part of the monk's diet was fasting. Monks in the Middle Ages strictly followed fasting days and periods that limited their diet. Fasting was not only a physical act of abstaining from food, but also an important spiritual practice aimed at purifying the soul. Fasting taught the monk humility, self-control, and helped him focus on spiritual matters rather than material needs. During Lent, monks often excluded meat, dairy, eggs, and other foods that could distract them from their true purpose, serving God. Fasting was also a way of repentance, inner purification, and fighting temptations. It allowed monks to feel closer to God, free themselves from worldly desires, and strengthen their spiritual practice. Fasting was also a way to combat pride and vanity. When monks restricted themselves in food, they showed their willingness to give up something earthly for higher goals. Instead of enjoying delicious food, they felt inner freedom by giving up these temptations. This element of monastic life helped monks to strengthen their faith and service. Even such mundane things as food became an integral part of their spiritual path, and each meal was filled with meaning and significance. Although the meals in the monastery were modest, the meal was a time that brought all the monks together, and it was an important moment when the community became one. Instead of each monk eating alone, in silence, the meal was a time for spiritual community. The monks gathered around one table, eating silently but together in one spirit. It was an important moment for the community to come together, when all the monks could feel that they belonged to one spiritual path. Monasteries sometimes held large meals for invited guests, such as pilgrims or locals. However, monastic meals were usually quiet and modest. The monks sat in rows and ate without speaking to each other, so as not to be distracted from their spiritual contemplation. It was not just a meal, but an act of reverence for what God had given them and an acknowledgement of that gift. Even in these simple, seemingly mundane acts, the monks found deep meaning. It is noteworthy that, despite the general simplicity and humility, the monks still tried to adhere to a high cultural tradition. Dinner, although not luxurious, was often accompanied by church hymns or readings of sacred texts. All these moments created an atmosphere in which food became not only a physical act, but also a spiritual experience, strengthening the monk on his path. Every meal for a monk was not only about satisfying hunger, but also about a spiritual process. Food in the monastery was more than just a physical need. It served as a moment of gratitude. Before eating, monks would say a special prayer of gratitude for the food provided. This prayer was said with the conviction that food was a gift from God and deserved deep respect. The monks not only prayed for their food, but they also understood its significance. When they ate bread, it was not just to satisfy their hunger, but also to symbolize that they, as children of God, lived in a world where their needs were met by God's will. It was a moment of modesty and humility when the monks accepted food without becoming slaves to it. In some monasteries, meals were reserved for holidays, when monks could feel that their work and loyalty to God had been rewarded. However, even at such moments, food was sufficient, but still modest. Only on particularly solemn occasions could delicacies such as wine or meat be allowed. But even these moments were within the bounds of humility, so as not to distract attention from true spiritual goals. It is also important to note that monastic food not only supported physical strength, but also supported the monk in his spiritual aspirations. Simple and modest food helped the monk to remain focused on his spiritual path. Monks believed that excessive pleasures, including those associated with food, could distract them from serving God and turn them away from the most important tasks, prayer and work. Therefore, every meal became a kind of test. Eating became a moment of self-discipline and reverence. It was a way to show one's devotion to God by limiting oneself in pleasures. Food did not become the goal of a monk's life, but only a means to maintain health and strength, to be ready for work and prayer. As mentioned earlier, the food in the monastery was very simple, but there was great symbolism hidden in this simplicity. Simple bread, water, and vegetables became symbols of the rejection of material goods and the desire for spiritual enlightenment. It was a symbol of the monks completely devoting themselves to God and rejecting everything that could distract them from holiness. Food in the monastery served spiritual purification. The simple diet forced the monk to focus not on pleasures, but on what was truly important. It was a symbol of humility and modesty, necessary to walk the path of holiness. In this context, food became part of the path that led to inner purification and spiritual perfection. Thus, food in the monastery was not simply a means of satisfying hunger, but a symbol of a life entirely dedicated to the service of God. Even in the simplest actions, such as eating, the monks found a deep spiritual meaning that filled their day with reverence and gratitude. The middle of the day in the monastery was not just a moment for rest or a break, but a time for spiritual purification, renewal of strength, and a deepening connection with God. Unlike the outside world, where rest is often perceived as a moment of relaxation or pleasure, in the monastery this moment had a much deeper and more spiritual meaning. The monks understood rest as a way to renew strength for further service, and midday prayers became an important part of their spiritual practice, helping to maintain inner peace and focus. Before we move on, let's dive into this important part of monastic life. For a monk, midday was not an empty pause. Instead, it was carefully structured to support his physical and spiritual health. The midday prayers and rest in the monastery were not simply a time for respite. They were an important stage during which the monk could renew his inner fire and return to his daily duties with renewed vigor. Rest in the monastery was an integral part of a larger cycle of prayer, work, and spiritual practices, allowing each monk to deepen his connection with God. The midday prayers, called sexta in monasteries, were part of a regular cycle of prayers that took place each day. Monasteries in the Middle Ages followed a very strict schedule, where each day was divided into several stages, each of which began and ended with prayer. The midday prayers were an important part of this ritual, reminding the monk of the need to renew his inner strength, spiritual vigor, and devotion. Typically, the sexta took place around midday, when the workday was already in full swing. It was at this moment that the monks, tired from hard work in the fields, in the workshop, or in the scriptorium, could once again turn to God and renew their connection with Him. The prayer of the sexta helped them focus on higher goals, overcoming the physical fatigue that work brought, and filling the heart with new spiritual energy. The midday prayer usually included reading the Psalter and other texts from the Holy Scripture. It could be short but profound, and its purpose was not physical rest, but the restoration of inner harmony. It was important that prayer become not just a procedure, but a spiritual act that reminded the monk of his higher calling. At such moments, each monk could feel himself at the center of a great service, connected to the common prayer of all the brothers of the monastery and the entire universe. The prayer of the sixth hour was also an opportunity for the monk to focus on his personal spiritual task. It was a moment when he could look within himself in peace and quiet, renew his aspirations, and decide how to use his strength for the day ahead. Although the sixth hour was part of a communal prayer, each monk found a moment in this time for a personal encounter with God. The midday prayers were always held in community. In this context, collective prayer acquired a special value. It was important that the entire community came together to pray and support each other. Mutual prayer in the monastery strengthened the brotherhood, creating a sense that each monk was part of something greater than himself. Together, they were a force that supported the community and ensured spiritual prosperity. The monks understood that prayer was not only a personal act of communion with God, but also a way to strengthen the bonds between brothers. The midday prayers, like other prayer services, created a sense of unity that supported not only each monk, but the entire community as a whole. It was a time when each could feel the support of others and was ready to return that support in a practical way through their own labor efforts. In addition to the prayers, monks could read passages from sacred texts that were particularly inspiring at that moment and helped everyone focus on the meaning of service. These moments were also an opportunity to convey doubts or worries to more experienced brothers who could offer advice or guidance. After the midday prayer, there was a moment of short rest, which was also an important part of the monastic routine. Rest in the monastery was not just a physical break from work. It was a time to recuperate not only the body, but also the spirit. Unlike what we think of as rest in the modern world, time for entertainment or worrying about personal matters. Monastic rest was a way to deepen one's connection with God through silence and reflection. The monks, lacking access to luxury and comfort, rested in the most simple conditions. They could walk through the monastery garden, watching the growing herbs and trees. A simple walk in the shade of the trees, or a quiet conversation with a brother about the days of work. This was a rest that strengthened the monk's spirit. The monastery garden, as well as other parts of the monastery, became a place of spiritual purification. The nature surrounding the monastery was perceived as a gift from God, and the monk used this time to purify his thoughts and experiences, focusing on spiritual matters. In addition, rest was an important moment for solitude and self-reflection. Monks often used this time for a short rest in their cells, where they could spend a few minutes alone, meditating or reflecting on the meaning of life and their service. It was a moment to renew their strength for further prayers and work, allowing the monk to maintain freshness and inner strength throughout the day. One of the key aspects of the midday rest was that it was a time for meditation and deep reflection. The monks did not view the rest as a time for idleness, but rather as an opportunity to clear the mind of external thoughts and focus on spiritual matters. It was a moment to reevaluate their actions, their prayers, and their role in the monastery. The monks often used this time to look at their day and decide what they could improve, what they could do better in their prayer practice, how they could better serve their brothers. It was a time of inner reflection, necessary to follow the path of spiritual perfection and continue to serve God. At the monastery, the entire day was imbued with a spirit of mindfulness and awareness, and the midday prayers and rest only reinforced this. The monks understood that the path to holiness was not just physical work, but also constant attention to one's inner life. So every break, every conscious breath, became an act of worship and part of their spiritual journey. For a monk, each day was a struggle against worldly temptations and a striving to be in unity with God. The midday prayers and short rests in the middle of the day were important tools in maintaining this inner purification. These moments not only allowed one to recuperate, but also to clear the mind, stay focused, and continue working in a spirit of prayer and devotion. The midday prayers were a way to understand one's faith more deeply, to strengthen oneself internally, and to continue the day with renewed strength. Thus, midday prayers and rest were not simply a time for monks to switch off from their work. They were times of restoration, renewal, and deep connection with spiritual principles. In these moments, monks could find strength and serenity to cope with difficult days, and also strengthen their resolve to walk the path of service to God. Continuing with the day with renewed strength and revived spiritual power, the monks continued on their way, confident that every moment of their lives, every gesture and every action has a high spiritual meaning. After midday prayers and a short rest, when the monks could recuperate and clear their minds, a new stage in their monastic life began, a time when they would once again immerse themselves in work and study. This was a time not only for continuing work, but also for deep study of sacred texts, philosophy, science, and art. Afternoon became an important time for the monks, when they had to continue their day, combining work with spiritual development and study. As already mentioned, monastic life in the Middle Ages was not limited to physical labor or prayer. Education and deep study of texts played a central role in the lives of monks, for monasteries, although places of prayer and solitude, were also custodians of knowledge and culture. This period of afternoon work and study in the monastery was an important link in the development of monks, and it encompassed not only intellectual pursuits, but also spiritual practices associated with study and research. Let's dive into the details of how monks used the afternoons for study and work. We'll explore how this time allowed monasteries to become not only centers of prayer, but also important repositories of knowledge, and how monks managed to combine work and intellectual development in their daily lives. After monks had completed their midday prayers and rest, they often turned to activities related to education and mentoring. This process was not just an intellectual exercise, but also an act of spiritual service. Knowledge, both religious and secular, was actively transmitted within the monasteries. Monks taught one another, younger ones learned from older ones, and older monks became mentors to newcomers. It was a time when each monk could deepen his knowledge and faith by studying texts, analyzing philosophy, and preparing himself for higher service. Monastic schools and scriptoria became centers of education and spiritual enlightenment. Not only theology was taught here, but also sciences such as astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and even music. In such educational institutions, monks could study the works of ancient philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, as well as the works of Christian thinkers such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. They read and discussed works that helped them understand not only religious truths, but also the nature of the world around them. The monks carefully studied the Holy Scriptures, mastered Latin, the language of the Bible and liturgy, and scientific treatises, which opened up new horizons of knowledge for them. However, the education in the monasteries was not only academic. Each study of sacred and philosophical texts was an immersion into a deeper understanding of religion and one's spiritual path. It was a way to better serve God and society, finding the connection between knowledge and faith. The monks also actively practiced mentoring, passing on knowledge and experience to younger brothers. These lessons could be both theoretical and practical. For example, an older monk could teach a younger one to farm, as well as share knowledge about medicine or the art of copying books. This time was not without significance and became the basis for the creation of entire monastic academies, which later became sources of scientific and philosophical discoveries. Afternoons in the monastery were also a time for work in the scriptorium. The scriptorium was a special place where monks were engaged in copying sacred texts, scientific treatises, and philosophical works. For the monks, this work was not just mechanical copying. Copying sacred books was considered a sacred work that brought them closer to God. With every word they wrote, the monks felt like they were becoming part of a great process of preserving knowledge and spiritual truth. The monks copied the Bible, liturgical books, commentaries, and works of the Holy Fathers. This was not only work for the benefit of the monastery, but also a contribution to the preservation of knowledge for future generations. Monasteries often kept ancient manuscripts and treatises that could have been lost in other parts of the world. Thanks to the efforts of the monks, many works of ancient philosophers and theologians have survived to this day. Copying was an important part of monastic life, as it not only preserved knowledge, but also helped monks deepen their knowledge by understanding and reflecting on each word they wrote down. Every day in the scriptorium became a spiritual practice, in which the monk not only served the community, but also fulfilled his service to God. Working in the scriptorium was a sacred activity, filled with respect for each word, which made the process more meaningful than simply copying texts. In addition to their studies in the scriptorium, the monks also engaged in other types of work that became an important part of their afternoon activities. The monasteries were self-sufficient units that included gardening, livestock breeding, and craft workshops. The monks, despite their religious orientation, were also engaged in farming and creating the necessary items for the monastery. These labor activities had not only practical significance, but also deep spiritual meaning. By working on the land or in the workshops, the monks served God by performing the work that was part of their monastic life. Agriculture was a vital element in the monasteries. The monks grew bread, vegetables, and fruits, and raised livestock. This not only provided the monastery with food, but also contributed to spiritual purification. The monks, working in the garden, found inner satisfaction, combining physical work with spiritual practice. The land they cultivated became a symbol of their labor service to God. Craft work, such as blacksmithing, clothing making, and leatherworking, were also an important part of monastery life. Not only did the monks create necessary items for themselves, but they also learned crafts that could help them survive in difficult times. These activities not only provided the monastery with everything it needed, but also became an important part of their education, linking labor with spirituality. Afternoon was also a time for reflection and meditation. Monks not only engaged in physical labor and study, but also used this time for deep inner work. Monasteries often held spiritual talks in which sacred texts, philosophical questions, and aspects of monastic life were discussed. Meditation and reflection helped the monk deepen his understanding of his spiritual practice, connect theology with everyday life, and find meaning in his actions. Monks often use this time to focus on their feelings and thoughts, try to recognize their mistakes, and improve their path. It was a moment when external work merged with internal spiritual work, allowing monks to become not only more skilled in their work, but also more enlightened in their service. After the monks had completed their personal reflection and work, there was a moment for communal prayer. The monks would gather for evening prayer, which helped close the day and connect their efforts with God's will. It was a time to thank God for the day, to discuss any moments that had been particularly important during the day, and to ask forgiveness for any mistakes that might have been made. Along with the evening prayer, the monks also shared their thoughts and experiences of the day. It was a time to discuss spiritual topics that became the basis of their monastic life. In this process of communication, they strengthened their community and reminded themselves of the importance of unity on the path to holiness. Thus, afternoons in the monastery were not only a time for work, but also for deep reflection, study, and spiritual growth. The monks continued their path of serving God through work and intellectual development, strengthening their faith and connection to the community. Evening in the monastery was not just the end of the day, but an important and sacred moment when the monks again immersed themselves in silence and peace to thank God for the day and to finish all their tasks with deep respect. Evening was a time for prayer, but also for spiritual reflection, summing up the day and, most importantly, for restoring inner peace and focus. It was a time when monks could retire to pray and reflect on their path, their actions, and service. Prayer and the meal at the end of the day were not only acts of worship, but also important rituals that helped maintain balance and peace of mind throughout life. Let's delve into this important part of monastic life and try to understand what evening prayers and meals meant for monks. What symbolism is hidden in these ordinary, yet extremely significant actions? How did monks use the evening to clear their minds, end the day, and find peace? Evening prayer was not just the last ritual of the day, but an important and profound act of worship, when monks connected with God to thank Him for the day and ask for forgiveness for their sins. This prayer was called Western, and its main purpose was to end the day in prayerful silence, in humility before God. The evening service was as important as the morning prayers because it helped the monk to cleanse his spirit, prepare for the night's rest, and tune in to inner peace. Evening prayer in the monastery usually included the recitation of psalms, hymns, and prayers. These prayers were devoted to gratitude, asking for forgiveness, and forgiving one's sins. It is important to note that prayer was not just an act of words, but also a state of mind. Monks often use this time to look back on the day, remember all their actions, successes, and failures, and evaluate how they had lived that day. It was a moment for inner purification, a moment to realize how close and important their service to God was. In addition, evenings in the monasteries were often accompanied by meditation, which consisted of reflecting on what they had read during the day. The monks meditated on Bible verses, tried to understand how they could apply the knowledge they had received in their lives, and prayed that their path would become clearer and more correct. Another important part of the evening prayer was that the monks could gather in a small circle to share their experiences with each other. Instead of small talk or light conversations about worldly matters, the monks would share what they had experienced during the day. This was a way to not only strengthen the spiritual community, but also to help each monk feel part of something greater than just himself. After evening prayer came the time for the evening meal. Unlike the morning and midday meals, the evening meal was often the simplest and most modest. It was the end of the day, a moment when the monks could partake of what had been prepared for them, but still remain modest and humble, mindful of their vow of poverty. The monks believed that the meal was not only a physical satisfaction, but also a way of giving thanks for God's gifts. It was at this moment that they could connect their daily food with spiritual meaning, feeling once again that everything they had was given to them by God, and for this they should be grateful. Breakfast and lunch in the monastery, as we have already said, were modest and filled with modesty. But the evening meal became the moment when the monks could relax a little more and share this moment with each other. Despite its simplicity, dinner was always served in the common refectory. The monks did not eat alone. This meal was a time for community, despite the silence that usually accompanied the meal. Food in the monastery was traditionally simple, including bread, some fish, vegetables, perhaps some cheese or milk. On occasion, especially during holidays or special occasions, a little meat or more substantial food might be allowed. However, even at these times, the monks remained modest in their desires and needs. The whole process of eating became a way to remind themselves of their spiritual path, of the rejection of luxury, of the rejection of all worldly things. Importantly, the meal in the monastery was not a moment of joy or celebration. Although food could be enjoyed, the atmosphere associated with it remained focused and calm. At the end of the meal, the monks thanked God for this simple gift and prayed for spiritual peace and tranquility. After the evening meal, there was a moment to rest and prepare for sleep. Unlike us in the monastery, a night's sleep was not only a physical rest, but also a part of the spiritual life. The monks believed that sleep should be a sacred act, and its importance lay in the fact that, plunging into the world of dreams, they could find time for prayer in their sleep. The monks went to their cells, which were quite modest and not very comfortable, but all this helped to ensure that their minds were not distracted from more important things. A simple bed served them only for resting the body, while their soul continued its path of serving God, even during sleep. Before going to bed, monks would say a short prayer, thanking God for a successful day and asking forgiveness for any mistakes they had made. This was an important part of preparing for sleep, helping them to strengthen their inner connection with God and cleanse themselves of any doubts, worries, or pride. It is also important to note that it was common for monasteries to hold night vigils, especially at times when deeper spiritual purification was needed. Night prayers and vigils were also a way to deepen their connection with God while in the peace and quiet of the night. During these prayers, monks could pray for the souls of the departed, for their brothers, and for the needs of the world. The monks also spent their time before sleep reflecting on what they had accomplished that day. It was a moment to evaluate their spiritual work, to reflect on what had been done well and what could be improved. Thus, sleep for a monk was not only a rest for the body, but also an important continuation of his service. On this night, the monks sought not only peace, but also inner harmony, readiness to meet a new day with renewed strength and determination to follow the path of God. This time also served for deep meditation on the meaning of life and prayer for the welfare of all beings. The monks, plunging into sleep, tried not to forget that life is a service, and every moment in it has an important spiritual meaning. Every act, even at night, was aimed at strengthening faith and preparing for the next day of service. So, the evening in the monastery was a time of completion, but also a moment for deep purification, spiritual renewal, and preparation for sleep. Evening prayer, evening meal, rest and sleep. All this was aimed at preparing the monks for the next day of service. At this moment, they found inner harmony and peace, understood the importance of their mission, and were restored for new labors. All this was an integral part of their spiritual path, where each day ended in the light of divine love and mercy. The night in the monastery is not just a time of rest, but an important part of monastic practice, filled with deep spiritual significance. For the monks, nighttime became a moment when they could continue to serve God even in their sleep. In the monastery, every aspect of life was subordinated to service, including rest and sleep. The night was not a time of empty reflection or worry, but a time of deep spiritual purification, prayer, and preparation for the next day. The monks believed that every moment of their lives, including the time they spent in peace, was part of their service to God and their inner spiritual work. Even sleep was a way for them to deepen their connection with God, and in this process, they found peace and calm. But the night at the monastery was not just about sleep. It was a time for vigils, for extra prayers, for reflecting on the day and how the monks could improve their lives and practice. Although the night might seem like a time for rest, the monks used this period to deepen their spiritual practice. Let's dive into the details of how monks experienced the night in the monastery, how they combined sleep and prayer, and what important spiritual practices were associated with nighttime. Before entering into the night's rest, the monks first performed a ritual of preparation, which was an important part of their spiritual practice. This process began with short prayers that helped them clear their thoughts and prepare for the night's rest. Each monk prayed for forgiveness before going to sleep, so that they could sleep with a clear conscience and peace of mind. This was a prayer for forgiveness for all the shortcomings they had encountered during the day, and a request for protection from any temptations that night. In this way, the night began not with fatigue or anxiety, but with the awareness of one's spiritual weakness and complete dependence on God's mercy. The monks knew that sleep was not only a time to recuperate physically, but also an important process of spiritual purification. Before going to sleep, they often read biblical psalms or other sacred texts that directed their thoughts and hearts to God. These texts became a reminder of the importance of each day in their lives and ministry. At the same time, they always began their preparation for sleep, with the understanding that even during rest, in sleep, they must be in touch with God. It was important for the monks that the night should not be a time for worry. Instead of being tormented by thoughts of worldly affairs, they used this moment to stop and focus on their spiritual path. It was a time for deep reflection, in which the monks tried to free themselves from all thoughts that disturbed their inner peace, and to restore harmony with God. Although many monks in the monasteries went to bed at night, it was also an important tradition to hold night vigils and perform night prayers. These prayers were an important part of their practice, as monks believed that night was a special time when a person's soul could be especially close to God. It was a time when monks could especially focus on their prayer and vigil, spending time in silence and in constant communion with God. Vigils could be held in silence, with monks praying for other communities, for the souls of the departed, and for their own sins and failures. They believed that prayer at night had a special power, as in the silence of the night they could sense the divine nearness. During moments of prayer, monks felt their souls being cleansed of the experiences of the day, and this spiritual work became no less important than work or prayers during the day. At this time, they not only prayed, but also tried to perceive the night as a gift from God, as an opportunity to escape from worldly concerns and fully devote themselves to spiritual practice. Night prayers and vigils became moments of especially deep connection with God for the monks. Some monasteries had a tradition of holding night vigils every night, while other monasteries only held these practices on certain days, such as important holidays or special occasions. These night prayers and vigils served not only as an act of service to God, but also as a way to be united with the community despite physical distance. Monks could sit or stand in prayerful silence, praying for others, asking for forgiveness, and seeking inner purification. Although monks were known for their strict routine, their nightly rest was no less important than their work and prayers. Sleep was necessary to restore their strength so that they would be ready for the next day of service. However, for a monk, sleep was not just a rest for the body, but also part of his spiritual practice. Monks believed that during sleep, as well as during waking moments, they should maintain a connection with God. Even in this state, they prayed, allowing their thoughts to immerse themselves in spiritual reflections and prayers. The monks slept in rather modest conditions. Their beds were usually simple wooden stools with a minimum of blankets. Sleep was also connected to their vow of poverty and asceticism. They did not seek comfort, but rather sought to ensure that their physical rest did not distract them from their spiritual goals. Sleep in the monastery was as important as prayer, because at that time the monk could truly give himself to God, without thinking about the outside world and its temptations. For monks, the night was a time of deep self-discovery. It was a time when they could reflect on their day, what they had done right, and what they could improve. While physical rest was important for recuperation, monks believed that this rest should be accompanied by inner prayer and reflection. The special atmosphere of the night was created by the silence that reigned in the monastery. Monasteries were usually located far from the noise of cities, and the night brought with it the peace and quiet that were necessary for the monk to focus on his spiritual path. The silence of the night created an atmosphere of solitude and peace, which allowed the monk not only to restore his strength, but also to deepen his connection with God. The silence of the night became a time of deep self-reflection. Monks often use this time to free their souls from worries, fears, or anxieties that might have arisen during the day. They accepted the night as a moment to get rid of all unnecessary thoughts, to leave behind everything earthly and to direct attention only to their spiritual goal. In addition, nighttime became a period for strengthening inner fortitude. Sleep in the monastery was not devoid of spiritual meaning. It was preparation for the next day, a new day of service to God. It was a cycle in which every moment was associated with the development of spirituality and inner work. Even in sleep, the monks continued to strive for purity, inner purification, and harmony. As the night drew to a close, the monks prepared for the next stage, morning prayers and the beginning of a new day of service. At the moment of awakening, the monks again turned to God, gave thanks for the night, and asked for strength for the coming day. The important point was that, despite physical fatigue, the monk again entered the new day with renewed spiritual strength and determination to serve God. The night in the monastery was not just a time of rest, it was a whole process, including vigils, prayers, reflection, and purification. Each aspect of the night was an important element of monastic practice, which allowed the monk to immerse himself in deep spiritual work and prepare for the next day. Despite their withdrawal from worldly life and their desire for solitude, the monks of the Middle Ages could not completely isolate themselves from the world around them. On the contrary, their role in society was quite significant, and monasteries became not only places of spiritual purification, but also centers that influenced the development of culture, science, and social structure. Despite their desire for asceticism and prayer, monks actively participated in the life of the surrounding society, helping people, spreading knowledge, and influencing the political and social processes of their time. The interaction of monks with the world was multifaceted and complex, and it is important to understand how their way of life and work served not only their own spiritual goals, but also the world around them. To understand how monks and monasteries influenced society, it is necessary to consider how they reconciled their spiritual lives with the real needs and problems of their time. The image of monks withdrawing from the world is often perceived as one of total renunciation, but in practice, monasteries and monks played a key role in preserving knowledge, helping the poor, teaching and defending moral and spiritual values that maintain social stability in an era of instability and constant warfare. Medieval monasteries were not only religious, but also cultural centers. They preserved not only sacred texts, but also knowledge of the ancient world, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. This was due to the monastic tradition of copying and preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. Monasteries actively taught not only spiritual life, but also secular sciences. Monks were engaged in rewriting ancient texts, which helped preserve and spread knowledge of Greek and Roman philosophy. Monasteries became a kind of intellectual centers, where scientists could exchange knowledge, where libraries worked, and where great thinkers of their time created. Monasteries became the main educational institutions, especially in the early Middle Ages, when educational institutions such as universities were just beginning to emerge. Monastic schools educated the children of aristocrats as well as poor peasant children, providing them with the opportunity to learn to read, write, and learn the basics of science. This became not only a spiritual mission, but also a social one. Monks believed that learning should be available to everyone, and thus monasteries played a key role in the spread of education and science throughout Europe. One should not forget the importance of monastic scriptoria, where monks copied not only religious texts, but also treatises on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The scriptorium was, in essence, a medieval printing house, where ideas were preserved and transmitted over the centuries. This played a huge role in preserving knowledge, especially during periods of political and social crises. One of the most important roles of monasteries was social service. Monks were the first to actively help the poor, the sick, and orphans. Monasteries were places where people who had lost their homes were often taken in and provided with the necessary resources. Monasteries maintained hospitals where monks treated the sick and cared for the elderly and infirm. In an era when medicine was primitive, monasteries became true centers for caring for people suffering from illness. Monks used herbs and plants to create medicines and concoctions, making them important medical workers of their time. In addition, monasteries often became shelters for the poor and needy. They provided people in trouble with food, shelter, and even basic medical care. In this sense, monasteries became important social institutions that maintained order and stability in society. In addition to their spiritual mission, monasteries also played an important role in agriculture. Monks worked the land, built water mills and dams, which contributed to the development of agriculture in the Middle Ages. Monasteries often became centers of agricultural production, which allowed them to provide themselves with food and also to help local communities. The monks experimented with new farming methods, improving crop yields. The use of new technologies such as crop rotation, plows, and water mills greatly increased the efficiency of agriculture. Monasteries became not only religious institutions, but also self-sufficient economic units that actively interacted with local communities, creating sustainable economic systems. In addition, monasteries often had their own craft workshops, where monks made clothes, candles, utensils, and other items. This allowed the monasteries not only to provide for themselves, but also to supply goods to local markets. Monasteries played an important role in political life in the Middle Ages. They often became centers of power, influencing the decisions of kings, princes, and even popes. For example, monasteries often received land from monarchs or high-ranking officials in exchange for spiritual support or prayers. The monks, in turn, used their power to influence local and even international affairs. Monasteries could be places where political alliances were made, agreements were made, and where questions of inheritance and property were decided. In the Middle Ages, when the political structure was unstable, monasteries became reliable bastions of stability. Being in an independent position and having their own resources, monasteries could influence events much more effectively than other secular institutions. In addition, monasteries became important political centers, with monks becoming advisors to rulers and participating in coronations. The influence of monasteries often manifested itself in matters of church, faith, and secular power, as many monks, with their knowledge and spiritual power, could play an important role in political decision-making. Monasteries were also centers of culture and art. Painting, architecture, and literature were actively developed in monasteries. Monks copied books, decorated manuscripts with gold letters and illustrations, creating real works of art. Monasteries became places where not only sacred texts were preserved, but also cultural works of that time. It was monks who created the first illuminated manuscripts, which not only conveyed knowledge, but also served as works of art. These books, often decorated with beautiful illustrations and gold patterns, became important objects for both religious and cultural purposes. In addition, monks were engaged in the creation of musical works, developing the foundations of church music, choral singing, and the development of liturgical rites. Monastic singing schools became the basis for the development of music in Europe, and the first musical works appeared in monasteries, which later spread throughout the continent. Thus, the monks of the Middle Ages, despite their detachment from worldly affairs, were an integral part of society. They actively participated in the preservation of knowledge, the development of science and culture, as well as in social life, helping the poor, treating the sick, and teaching the youth. Monasteries became strongholds that supported the moral, spiritual, and economic foundations of society. Monks became the link between the spiritual and secular worlds, between education and everyday life, between wealth and poverty. In their hands were not only religious texts, but also knowledge that helped society develop and prosper. Monasteries became not just places for prayer and solitude, but important centers influencing the entire medieval civilization. In this way, monks not only avoided worldly concerns, but also served the world, making it more harmonious and spiritually rich. Through their work, prayer, and service, they left an indelible mark on history, and their contribution to the development of culture, science, and social order continues to be felt to this day. The death of a monk in the Middle Ages was not just a natural process, but a significant event that largely determined how the monk perceived his life and what purpose he had achieved in serving God. Unlike laymen, who often sought to preserve life or worldly pleasures, monks saw death as the completion of their spiritual path, an important stage on the way to eternal life, and the moment when they could finally unite with God. The process of a monk's death was surrounded by many rituals and ceremonies that emphasized the importance of his life's service and paid tribute to his spiritual mission. The death of monks was not perceived with bitterness or fear. It became part of their spiritual life, an act of transition, purification, and return to God. Eternity was perceived as something real, and, according to the monks, death was only an instantaneous transition to a new, eternal, blessed world, where they could appear before God and receive a reward for their labors on earth. However, death was not only a personal moment, but also an important event for the entire monastic community, which through this ritual confirmed its faith and commitment to religious principles. The attitude towards death in medieval monasteries was closely connected with their perception of God, life, and inner purification. Let us take a closer look at how monks faced their death. What happened in their final hours, what rites and rituals accompanied their passing, and what this meant for their brotherhood and for the monastic community as a whole, how death became the culmination of their service, and what exactly this death meant in the context of monastic life and the spiritual path. When a monk began to feel that his life was approaching its end, it became noticeable not only to him, but also to his brothers. In the monasteries, there were certain rituals and customs that allowed one to predict the approach of death. Waiting for death in the monastery was not a tragedy, but a solemn moment in which the monk was ready to meet the divine will. Waiting for the last day was part of spiritual preparation, and the monks believed that the most important thing in this process was inner humility and readiness to meet God. There were also certain signs that allowed monks, as well as their brothers, to notice that the end was near. For example, a monk might begin to feel tired and weak, and his health would rapidly deteriorate. Some monks would begin to see deathbed visions, feeling the presence of God or angels. These spiritual experiences were considered important and were seen as a sign that the monk's soul was preparing to meet God. In addition, monks in monasteries often lived very modestly, following a strict routine of life and asceticism, which could cause accelerated aging or illnesses that at some point became severe and inevitable. However, it is important to note that, despite physical pain, monks accepted it with inner peace, believing that suffering purifies the soul, bringing it closer to God. When death approached, the monk prepared to meet it with prayer and humility. At this moment, not only the state of the body was important, but also spiritual preparation. The monk often asked his brothers to pray for him so that he could meet death with a pure heart and not be bound by earthly desires. This was the time for the final cleansing of sins and preparation to stand before the face of God. Monks, as a rule, continued to pray in the last hours of their lives. It was not so much death itself that was important, but how the monk met it. Not only his fate depended on prayer, but also the life of his brotherhood, since the death of a monk, like his life, left a mark on the spiritual life of the entire community. The last prayers were often full of repentance, requests for forgiveness, and recognition of one's weaknesses and shortcomings. They could be simple words spoken in the shadow of death, but these words were filled with deep spiritual meaning that expressed the monk's readiness to meet the Lord. For example, a prayer of repentance or an appeal to God's mercy was often said. Monks, as a rule, did not die alone. Their last hours of life were surrounded by careful religious rites and rituals. In the last moments before death, other monks would approach the dying man to support him in prayer and to turn to God with requests for forgiveness and mercy. These last minutes were important for the entire community because the departure of one of the monks became a moment for joint prayer and reflection on eternity. Usually, senior monks and mentors were present at these moments, helping the dying man. They could read to him from sacred books, remind him of the salvation of his soul, and even say prayers for forgiveness. All this filled the last moments of the dying monk not only with physical pain, but also with spiritual meaning. The monastery was ready to see the dying man off to the very end, performing rituals that helped the transition to another world. Monks also followed strict ceremonies in their final moments. For example, the dying were often confessed and given communion. This act was important because through communion, a monk could cleanse his soul before death and prepare himself to meet God. Communion became not just a sacred act, but also a way to sanctify the soul, to secure its holiness and readiness for the transition. After the monk's death, an important burial ceremony took place, which was also imbued with deep spiritual significance. The burial of a monk in the Middle Ages was associated not only with the physical body, but also with spiritual purification. Everything took place in an atmosphere of strict monastic rites, which were accompanied by prayers, reading the Psalter, and other sacred actions. The monk was kept with the honors that corresponded to his life, and the ceremony was full of respect and solemnity. The monk usually did not have a grave like a layman, and his body was buried in a special monastery enclosure, in a cemetery where only monks were buried. The grave was not just a place for the body, but also a symbol of the connection with eternity, and with the spiritual values by which the monk lived. Particular attention was paid to the burial, which became an act of veneration for the monk and his spiritual path. Sometimes a memorial service was held, and the monks prayed for his soul. These prayers served not only to help the soul of the deceased, but also to strengthen the faith of the living in the power of prayer and forgiveness. The death of a monk was not only the end of his life's journey, but also the beginning of a new stage for his community. Monks believed that after death they continued their mission, being part of a greater community of believers. Many monasteries preserved the memory of their monks through memorial prayers, and even through icons painted in honor of those who had passed. The memory of the monk lived on in the community through prayers and stories about his life dedicated to serving God. Death became a reminder for the living of the importance of the spiritual path, of how important it is to live with God and be faithful to one's service. Sometimes, if the monk was especially outstanding, he was canonized, and his life became an example for future generations. Church holidays associated with the memory of the deceased monk became important events for the community and the monastery. Monks remained alive in the memory of their brothers, and in the spiritual practices they continued to follow. A monk's legacy became part of the life of the monastery, and his path inspired others to new spiritual achievements. For a monk, death was not the end, but an important transition to a new, eternal life. Unlike lay people, who often fear death and see it as the end of everything, monks perceived it as a meeting with God. The monastery was the place where death became part of the spiritual path, a symbol of the transition from temporary life to eternal life. Farewell to a monk was a solemn act that united everyone who knew him and became a reminder of the importance of service, vows, and spiritual devotion. The monk's death was not a tragedy, but part of his great goal, to achieve holiness and closeness to God. The monasteries continued to live, preserving the memory of their brothers, and each departing monk remained part of a great spiritual community whose service continues through the centuries. Monasticism in the Middle Ages left a deep mark on the history of mankind, the influence of which is felt even today. Although monks sought a life of solitude, in renunciation of the world and its pleasures, their activities had an indelible impact on culture, science, social institutions, and the spiritual development of society. Monasteries became not only spiritual centers, but also cultural, educational, and social institutions. The service of monks went far beyond their own walls and became the basis for the development of entire societies and states. Let us consider what legacy the monks left behind, how their activities and principles of service, even through the centuries, continue to influence us, and how monastic life has transformed over time, adapting to new challenges and demands. The monastic orders that began to develop in the early centuries of Christianity continued to play a key role in the spiritual and cultural life of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. However, their influence was not limited to this historical period. The influence of monasticism also extended into subsequent eras, including the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and even the Reformation. Even today, many of the monasteries that remain in various parts of the world continue to inspire, teach, and serve the high spiritual and educational ideals that they have professed for centuries. The first and perhaps most important legacy of monasticism is that monasteries became the primary repositories of knowledge throughout the medieval era. Contrary to what is often portrayed in popular culture, monks not only prayed and worked, but also actively participated in the preservation and advancement of human knowledge. As science and culture were threatened in Europe during the Middle Ages by attacks from barbarian tribes, constant warfare, and political instability, monasteries became the places where ancient Greek and Roman texts, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and even engineering knowledge were preserved. The monks copied not only sacred books, but also the works of ancient philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists. These copied texts were distributed throughout Europe, and monasteries became centers where scientists, philosophers, and theologians studied. All this knowledge was passed on to future generations, including through scriptoria, where the monks, through their work, ensured the preservation of the cultural heritage of antiquity. However, monasteries not only preserved texts, but also actively worked on creating new ones. Monks were engaged in scientific research, developing philosophy, theology, mathematics, and astronomy. Even in the darkest ages, monasteries were pulsating centers for the formation and dissemination of knowledge. Through monastic schools and universities founded in monasteries, the ideas of ancient thinkers such as Aristotle and Plato, as well as the works of the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, came to Europe. Monasteries were the first places where knowledge in various disciplines, from medicine to architecture, was preserved and continued over the centuries, which later helped to create the basis for the Renaissance and scientific revolutions that swept Europe centuries later. One of the greatest contributions of monasticism is that monasteries became centers of learning and cultural progress. Monks not only preserved knowledge, but were also active in teaching others. Schools were established in monasteries, where children from both the noble and poor strata of society were educated. These schools taught the basics of grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology, as well as mathematics and astronomy. The role of monastic schools was extremely important, since other educational institutions were virtually non-existent at the time. Monasteries became the only places where an organized system of education was available. Monks were also active in the creation of literary works. Many monks wrote treatises, poems, and philosophical works that later became the basis for the development of scientific and religious thought. For example, Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous philosophers of the Middle Ages, created works that became the basis for Christian theology in Europe. He not only systematized religious teachings, but also introduced philosophical ideas into them, which allowed them to rethink many questions about human existence and God. monasteries played a particularly important role in the spread of literacy. Since monastic education was the primary means of access to writing, monks became the first custodians of books and archives, as well as catalysts for literacy in society. All of these factors contributed to the development of education, which in turn influenced the cultural and scientific development of Europe in the centuries that followed. An equally important legacy of monasticism was its influence on art, music, and architecture. Monasteries produced magnificent works of art, including paintings, sculptures, and frescoes that decorated churches and monastery walls. Monasteries were major patrons of artistic works, and the artists who worked for them created works that not only reflected religious ideas, but also served educational purposes. The monks also actively developed church music, including the development of Gregorian chant, which became the basis for many subsequent musical traditions. This chant, in turn, had a huge influence on the development of choral and religious music in Europe. The monasteries created a system of musical notation, which allowed the musical heritage to be disseminated and passed on to future generations. The architecture of the monasteries also left an unforgettable mark on history. Monasteries were built not only as places of prayer and solitude, but also as fortresses and cultural centers. Many monasteries had their own libraries, schools, as well as hospitals and scriptoria. The architecture of these monasteries, including Gothic cathedrals, became a symbol of the spirituality and grandeur of the Christian world. Monasteries in the Middle Ages also played a huge role in the social life of society, providing assistance to the poor and sick. Monks followed the ideals of mercy and charity, helping those in trouble. Monasteries opened hospitals where they treated the sick and suffering, and also provided shelter for the poor and travelers. It was the monks who became the people who brought hope and support in the most difficult times for society. Monasteries became centers of social welfare in a world plagued by wars, famines, and epidemics. Monks provided meals for the poor, supported orphans, and helped those in need. Monasteries played a particularly important role during epidemics such as the plague, helping the sick, caring for them, and providing them with the bare necessities of life. At their core, monasteries were centers not only of religious life, but also of social assistance, making them an integral part of the social structure of medieval Europe. Today, monasticism continues to exist, but in a slightly different form. Modern monasteries have retained their basic principles, but have adapted to the challenges of our time. For example, many monasteries now actively participate in educational projects, help with social work, support environmental initiatives, and work to strengthen spiritual values in society. These monasteries continue to preserve traditions, but are also open to change and new forms of service. Monasteries today are not only places for prayer, but also cultural and social centers. Modern monasteries are engaged in environmental activities, develop educational projects, help in the treatment of addicts, and conduct research in the field of theology and philosophy. Monasticism continues to play an important role in the lives of many people, providing spiritual support and help to those in need. Despite changes, monasteries remain a symbol of spirituality, devotion, and service, and their legacy continues to influence the world, bringing the light of faith and love. Monastic service in the Middle Ages left a deep mark on the history of mankind. It not only contributed to the preservation of knowledge and cultural traditions, but also formed the moral and spiritual foundations of society. Monasteries were centers of education, culture, medicine, and social assistance. The influence of monasticism is still felt, and even in the modern world, many monasteries continue to live, inspiring people to spiritual searches and service. Monasticism, as a way of life, continues to be a source of strength, peace, and faith for those who decide to dedicate their lives to God and service to people.